Hello, everyone. Mr. Nobody here, and I'm bringing you another installment of Making Nobody Happy. And this time, I want to talk about Cinderella, the classic fairy tale, the classic movie, and I just want to share some thoughts on that. So, our topic for today is why Cinderella is a hero. So, after watching all of the recent revisionist versions of Cinderella, which focus on how the heroine is doing just fine and doesn't need to be saved or valued or rescued from her plight by anyone, much less a man, I sometimes wonder if women would appreciate it just as much if we released some updated romances where the men felt the same about the women, where they felt just as indifferent, needless, and independent. Wouldn't a more modern prince stop groveling at Cinderella's feet and go off and live his own life and savor his own accomplishments and interests? Perhaps he'd even realize that marriage is simply a trap to contain his independence and gain access to his wealth and labor, leading him to instead embracing a bachelor existence of self realization and casual sexual relationships. How would women like the men in their favorite stories to become as indifferent and critical and dismissive of their need for women as modern heroines are of men? Give those poor guys some porn and free them from the restrictive hegemony of the relationship industrial complex. These romantic heroines are exploiting men's need for sex and the pleasantries of femininity. Men don't need no women. Men can do it all and have it all on their own. Modern life can liberate them. After all, you can buy or pay for almost everything women traditionally did for men. You can hire someone to take care of your house and make it nice, or just do without it. You can buy food in a million places. You can get decorations with ease online. You can find companionship among your friends. You can live a perpetual adolescent dream and never have to sacrifice yourself to the demands of the other sex. Women, or at least our idealistic heroines, don't need men anymore, and so I assume our heroes shouldn't need women either. In today's world, what do you need women for? All of the comforts of life are available if you have the money, and you can save a lot of money by not wasting it investing in the opposite sex. You get yours, boys. If sex is necessary, you can get it without needing to commit to a romantic relationship anymore. Porn is free and scratches that same itch and requires virtually no investment or effort. Porn doesn't demand a stake in everything you have and earn. It doesn't make any demands on you or expect it to do anything or expect you to do anything to deserve it. These comparisons probably sound strange and horrible to women, but maybe that's because you're a woman. Men, I'm sure, can understand what I'm saying. The feelings generated by these attitudes are similar no matter which side of things you're standing on. But all of this is rather beside the point. Cinderella is about many things, and masculine dominance isn't one of them. It's entirely a female fantasy. It's a female empowerment story, and it always has been. All that has changed is the predominant idea of what empowerment means and how it would be a good way to dramatize it in a story. Bad fortune tends to be pretty extreme in fairy tales, and reversals of fortune are just as extreme in them. The heroes aren't merely slightly less well off than they could be. They're orphans, cursed, destitute, lonely, betrayed, poor, hunted, enslaved, captive, or crippled. And they don't just slightly improve on their circumstances, they achieve extremes. They become rich, beautiful, powerful, free, famous, blessed, and beloved. Cinderella is a story about extremes. She's at the bottom and she ends up at the top in an unexpected, miraculous reversal of fortune. It's not like she was doing okay and over a period of years gradually improved her lot. And her destitution wasn't just economic or social, it was familial. She'd lost her family and had no one who was on her side. That's a pretty big deal and would have seemed an even bigger deal to people of the past than it is to us today. Your family was everything. Your people who were in your corner were your whole world. It was them and you against the world. And Cinderella had lost all of that, and worse, had fallen into the hands of enemies. But she has a chance to escape, to be welcomed, to be seen for how lovable she truly is, for just a single night. and along comes the most powerful family in the country saying that they want her. The prince is her point of connection, but it's far more than just a man that she gets. She gets justice and validation and deserved transformation from the universe itself. She goes from a serving girl to a princess in a moment. Part of what the story is trying to address is this feeling of injustice, that sometimes the world is just terribly unjust and cruel and seems to be set against you, even when you've done nothing wrong, even when you've done everything right. And that's something that really bothers people in their moral sense, but it's a very realistic thing to be bothered about. There is an arbitrary and unjust element to fate, as well as to the capricious vindictiveness of other people. We feel that we should have people to love us, and that the people in our world, especially our family, should fulfill that need. And sometimes that's just not the case. People can dreadfully disappoint us, even when we do everything that we can to please them. It's terribly unjust and tragic, but it's one of the truths of human experience. And fairy tales are usually about addressing the deep truths of human experience. If you fail to capture the nature of the story, then you fail to capture those deep truths. And that's where some of the modern adaptations really fall down. If you blunt the suffering and injustice of Cinderella's situation, which some of them do, you hobble the entire point of the story. And although there are many wonderful stories about working your way through difficult experiences, Cinderella isn't about that. The injustice that Cinderella faces is extreme and it's arbitrary. Maybe it's even worse than arbitrary because it's not only unconnected to her own behavior. It's not like she personally made some mistakes. It's almost in spite of it. It's anti-justice. Like Jesus, she gives kindness and service and love and receives cruelty and destitution. She reaps a reward the opposite of what she puts in. And that's a very specific sort of problem, one that is real and that troubles us, and one that can't simply be just gradually worked through, especially in a fairly short story. Because the whole point is that even her best efforts have yielded only more suffering. Modern retellings that attempt to soften either the nature of her suffering or what her pursuit by the prince really means for her have missed the point. The prince isn't just a man. He's not a man exactly. He's hardly even a character in some stories. He's more like the emissary of fate, a force for moral justice that the fairy godmother represents. He's a conveyance. He's a means for the reversal of arbitrary and unjust fortune into just fortune. In a moment, Cinderella gains a single means that conveys both economic, social, and familial triumph. She doesn't just have status, she has the highest status. She doesn't just have a family, she has the number one family. She doesn't just have security and wealth, she has the most security and wealth of anyone in the kingdom. And a prince is really just a good way to get all of that really quickly, because those are the sorts of goods that a prince has, and that a prince would be willing to give wholesale to a serving girl purely on the strength of his own personal esteem for her. Offering a girl the world is exactly the sort of thing a man would do, and exactly the sort of thing a woman would appreciate. It's appropriate. It's actually realistic. As I've said, Cinderella isn't only or even primarily about male-female relationships. It's about the relationship of struggling humanity to the whims of fortune and the injustices that even the good must often endure, and our wish to see good be rewarded and recognized instead of punished and abused for its goodness. The prince is, as I said, a convenient and appropriate and realistic symbolic mechanism, but it's a moral fantasy in many ways, almost more than it is a romantic fantasy. That's what gives the story of Cinderella its universal appeal. Because even if we've never been a serving girl in a household ruled by someone who isn't our parents, we have all suffered unjustly and have good deeds and good work returned with scorn and failure. So it's a moral power fantasy expressed through a distinctly feminine lens. But that's why it's a universal story. Anyone can enjoy it. Another way to look at the story of Cinderella is as a story of social status and justice and injustice within the female dominance hierarchy. Um, Remember, again, men play a fairly minimal role in this story. Who is Cinderella in a struggle with? Her mother and sisters, other women in her family, or rather people who pretend at being her family but in no way behave like it, exploiting and abusing her and degrading her. The people in her family should be the people preserving and defending and advancing her status and value, but she's been deemed a loser within her own intimate circle. And the most intimate circle for women tends to be other women. And they can be terrifically cruel as well as terrifically kind. Cinderella is in a tight-knit group that forms the very world around her, but that world has judged her and decided she's either a rival that must be removed or an insect that must be stepped upon. That's a rough fate, and one we can all sympathize with, men and women. We all, after all, desire the approval of the group. We want to be loved and valued and welcomed and esteemed by our intimate peers. Often it's the deepest desire of people's hearts and something they spend their whole lives chasing. But Cinderella has been judged and rejected by her group and has no prospects for improving her lot. If social media existed at the time, she would be getting piled on by her entire friend group. In the race for status within the feminine social hierarchy, she's just the biggest loser. The fantasy that the prince represents is the fantasy of escape into and validation within an alternative hierarchy, one that isn't concerned about her low status. And although there are many hierarchies, the primary alternative to the feminine social hierarchy is the masculine social hierarchy. What better answer to the censure of the feminine hierarchy than the acclaim of the masculine? So is it just arbitrary that it's a prince who enables this transformation? Not at all. Who you can select or attract as a mate is perhaps the oldest and most effective measure of status within the social hierarchies. It's an easy measure of just where you ended up. And women are absolute social elitists when it comes to mating. As much as they often desire fair and equalitarian status when it comes to children or those they feel magnanimous towards, they are ruthlessly competitive when it comes to sexual rivalry. So not only are they in competition with one another, they are brutally selective when it comes to men, focusing almost entirely on the upper quintile. And this is something that has been thoroughly studied. They focus on the best because they think they deserve the best. And most men count as undesirable. So from Cinderella's point of view, her virtues have been disregarded or outright punished by her female peers. She's suffered. Her value has not been recognized. But along comes a prince, a representative of the very pinnacle of the male social hierarchy. And assortative mating means that only the women of highest value will be able to command the attention of the highest value men and vice versa. So if you're a man and a really high status woman chooses you, that really says something about you and how well you've been judged by the feminine hierarchy. And if you're a woman and a high status or top status man pursues you, it means that you must be worth pursuing. This is how people think in the back deep parts of our mind that are just common to us and all sorts of other animals. So having a prince fall in love with Cinderella is an argument that her own feminine social hierarchy can't possibly respond to. It just smashes all their conclusions, it wrecks all their systems, it reveals that they were always dreadfully wrong about her, and she really was a princess all along. The job of the prince is simply to recognize that fact and pursue and realize it in spite of the arguments and even the direct efforts of the feminine hierarchy to dissuade him. He will not let her go, he will not forget her, and he will not accept the efforts of the sisters to pass themselves off as the real princesses, which is a key part of the story, actually. The prince is insightful. That's one of his key things. He's an insightful person. He can identify the true princess. He isn't fooled by false appearances. He's determined to reveal the truth and find the true princess. And that princess is Cinderella. And that feels really good. That's very fulfilling. So in this sense, proving the corrupt feminine hierarchy wrong is the crux of this way of looking at the story. The prince is the key person who can be convinced of Cinderella's worth, and he's someone who has enough status and independence coming from an outside hierarchy and from the top of it to stand up and override the corrupt system that Cinderella lives in. So she's been chosen by the top dog among the males, and that means her sisters were wrong in assigning her bottom status. So wrong, in fact, that it calls into question the entire structure. And typically, in most versions of the story, the mother and the sisters get their just desserts, and they end up at the bottom themselves. Assuming they live. There's one version of the story I read where they end up committing treason, attempting to prevent Cinderella's marriage, and they get executed for their trouble. But in either case, when Cinderella rises, she takes the place she properly deserves, and she brings the whole feminine social hierarchy that had abused her into its proper order. You know, nature or some benevolent cosmic force seeks justice. It rewards the virtuous, and the wicked are punished, essentially. So the prince is the mechanism. He's something we can understand and believe in. But Cinderella, in its classic form, is a story about the triumph of goodness and justice in the face of both arbitrary and deliberate misfortune. It doesn't need to be improved or fixed. It's terrifically complex and it's well thought out. And the attempts of modern storytellers to improve it so often fail because they don't really understand or appreciate what the story is about, or why it's lasted so long, or why it's been enjoyed by so many different people and cultures. Because Cinderella is a story that is in some form just everywhere. It's all over the world. It's immensely popular. It takes all kinds of different forms. So Cinderella tells us a story we all understand about something we all care about. It's a fairy tale, a classic myth, and Cinderella is a hero. She always has been the hero. She's a moral hero. She's the best kind of all heroes, suffering in the worst of conditions. And she wins on completely appropriate terms for a moral hero. She wins on the basis of her own internal excellence. She's the female Luke Skywalker, whose sword was not his strongest weapon, but rather his character, and that's how he defeats the corrupt hierarchy. Now, that is a tale as old as time, and it's one worth telling. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.